usually like to tell folks how I fell into writing about Rhode Island. I'm a Midwesterner. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. I grew up there, born and raised. I went to school in Minnesota and in Iowa. I did not go to graduate school thinking I was going to write about slavery. I went to graduate school to be a labor historian. My father was a laborer. I grew up in a working class union family. And I was very interested and enamored of unions, especially the tension between unionization and race. I was a daddy's girl. My dad was about 47 years old, was 47 years older than me. And I grew up in union halls with him. And so I went to graduate school thinking that I was going to study labor unions. I think someone needs to mute. I'm hearing a conversation in the background. All right, so how did I end up studying Rhode Island? When I was in graduate school, we were told that we had to be broad and wide, that I just couldn't focus on 20th century African-American history, that I had to tell a larger story, and that I had to have a larger history. And so I had to take early African-American history courses and early American history courses, which I was not interested in. And I took a course called Early African-American History. And in that course, one of the books that we read was Joanne Pope Mellish's Disowning Slavery. And that book changed the trajectory of my career. Meeting Joanne, who was one of the most brilliant and generous folks I've ever met in my entire life, changed the trajectory of what I was going to do with my life as a historian. That book blew my mind, Disowning Slavery. I thought I knew a little something about slavery, although frankly, I wasn't that interested. It was a history that I did not feel comfortable with when I was taught it at school. It was all about the horrible things that happened to Black people, and I just wanted to disappear. But I thought I knew a little something about it. I knew my family was descended from slavery. I knew I was only 3 generations out. And that book really changed my entire attitude toward thinking about slavery. And long story short, I wrote a paper in that graduate seminar class, which was surveying the scholarship of Northern slavery. And I ran across 2 things. The first was Jay Cottrey's Notorious Triangle, which is all about the transatlantic slave trade and specifically about Rhode Island. And I also read Sidney James, who also wrote about Rhode Island, colonial Rhode Island, and Ira Berlin, one of the titans in the scholarship of the history of slavery. And 3 things really stood out to me. A couple of things really stood out to me. One was that there was a curiously high number of enslaved people in Rhode Island by 1750, 10%, which was relatively high compared to its New England neighbors. There was the Rhode Island trade in African slaves where they were dominating. And I found that really interesting. And then this talk about the Narragansett and the Narragansett farmers and the West Indian trade. And so I began to think about, okay, where's the book that focuses on the institution of slavery in Rhode Island from the point of view of the enslavers, as well as the point of view of the enslaved? And I could not find that book. And I was expressing that frustration to my advisor. She said, well, that's your dissertation, right? Like, you're intensely interested in this. This is the question that you want to ask. And so that dissertation became, many years later, Dark Work, The Business of Slavery in Rhode Island. And so, like I said, I didn't go into graduate school thinking that I was going to study slavery in the North, or Rhode Island. It's something that I came into. So I'm going to get started, but I always like to give folks a little bit of background of why Rhode Island. Presence of people of European and African descent in this place that we now call the United States is relative recent history. Indigenous peoples have called this place home for tens of thousands of years. Their history did not begin with European colonization, although their lives and livelihoods were profoundly impacted by it. The Narragansett are the descendant of the Aboriginal people of the state of Rhode Island, and they have been on this land for more than 30,000 years. They are still here and continue to fight to protect the land and the waterways. If there's one thing that I could really change about Dark Work, it was the attention that I did not pay to Indigenous history. Indigenous history wasn't part of my academic background, which, says something within itself, that you can get a PhD in American history and take very little or no Indigenous history. And so I always try to begin here, reframing this place as it was for millennia before there was ever any Europeans here, ever any Africans here, and thinking about that space as it was before its most recent history. Throughout the northern colonies and states, enslaved men, women, and children labored in the business of slavery. Their collective labor sustained the multitudes of enslaved people that cultivated sugar in the West Indies, tobacco and rice in the southern colonies. But nowhere was the connection more salient than in Rhode Island, where the business of slavery was the cornerstone of the economy. The enslaved, however, refused to be treated as simple objects or products. They resisted their bondage and strove to build full lives within the strictures of slavery. I define the business of slavery as all economic activity that was directly related to the maintenance of slaveholding in the Americas, specifically the buying and selling of people, food, and goods, right? So the plantation doesn't just exist on its own. It's dependent on merchants, on traders, on farmers. It was the business of slavery that allowed New England to become an economic powerhouse without ever producing a staple or cash crop. Rhode Island is one of the best places to study the impact of the business of slavery because it was both exemplary and exceptional. Like their northern neighbors, Rhode Islanders bought and sold people and supplies that kept plantations in the Americas thriving. However, Rhode Islanders were the most deeply invested, right? When we think about the geography of Rhode Island, right? The regular flooding, right? In the South, the waterways, right? People traveled by boat, right? There are miles and miles of shoreline. New England colonists supplied colonists in the West Indies with enslaved people, livestock, dairy products, fish, candles, and lumber. These are all essentials. These are all essential to the operation of the plantations in the West Indies. In return, they received cash, which was really important in this barter economy, and molasses that they distilled into rum. This trade began in the late 17th century and flourished in the 18th century as rum becomes a currency in and of itself. It was the West Indian trade that propelled Newport out of Boston's shadow and into the status of a major city and established Providence as a major port. Rum becomes the #1 export out of Rhode Island.